It works as in the Marxist way. Karl Marx's proposition, from everybody according to their ability and to everybody according to their needs, was a very attractive idea.
I chose my friends carefully. The Marxist professors, the Marxist professors, the Marxist professors.
You very often have all kinds of unintended adverse consequences. So I had to experiment, subversive activity. That was a lot of fun.
The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in your enemy's country, be it moral traditions, religion, respect to your authority and leaders, cultural traditions, anything. Put white against black, old against young, I don't know, wealthy against poor, and so on. Doesn't matter. As long as it disturbs society, as long as it cuts the moral fiber of a nation, it's good. And then you just take this country, when everything is subverted, when the country is disoriented and confused, when it is demoralized and then destabilized, then the crisis will come.
So what is his target now? Us, America.
And we need people like George Soros, who is fearless and willing to step up when it counts.
Chancellor Merkel showed great moral leadership when she opened Germany's doors wide to refugees.
Protests have been happening, and they've been smashing storefronts, smashing cars. Just take a look at the map right now, because this is where we saw it in Portland, we saw it in some different cities, but look at this. It's now even spread to Florida, upwards Boston, up into Detroit.
Here's the thing about these. Usually protests spread when their legitimacy is growing, right? If you think about that, like legitimacy and the cases being building and things are getting bigger, this is spreading because it's intentionally being spread. More news is coming out about the funding from outside organizations, left-wing organizations, international organizations of elites that want to just say Donald Trump's not legitimate. Apparently the vote didn't matter.
And leaders behind these protests, including, we now learn, George Soros, Reverend Al Sharpton, Michael Moore, who's shown up to these protests. And so, getting out this message via social media, emails out to individuals, as Donald Trump had criticized these protests in the days after the election. They are not spontaneous. They're organized.
Right, but George Soros' piece is denying exactly what you're saying. He's saying this is not coming from outside funding. How dare you say that?
Shocking. George Soros, of course, will deny it. Having worked and seen organizations like this work for over a decade, they hide their funding. They never admit it. The group behind these protests and the ones that may happen at the inauguration, it's a group called Answer, International Answer, founded to oppose America after 9/11. It was an anti-war front group for the Marxist-Leninist Workers' Party. These are communists. These are who believe that the U.S. is racist, imperialist, sexist, but at the heart of war crime, it's seriously, at the heart of it is anti-Americanism. And part of these protests are part of the reason why Donald Trump got elected. People are sick of agitators telling us that our country isn't special.
But you know what is American? Is the democracy. It's getting out and voting. And so you see these cities where you're seeing these protests, actually a lot of them stayed home and didn't vote on election day.
The United States has undergone a cultural, moral, and religious revolution. And so this is the basis of the great cultural war we're undergoing right now. And this militant, it is an anti-Christian, anti-God, anti-traditionalist revolution. It's partly the sexual revolution has a lot to do with it and how people live. And so we are two countries now. We are two countries morally and socially and culturally and theologically, and cultural wars do not lend themselves to peaceful coexistence. One side prevails or the other prevails, and the truth is that while the conservatives, in my judgment, we won the Cold War with political and economic communism, we've lost the cultural war with cultural Marxism, which I think has prevailed pretty much in the United States, or is now the dominant culture, whereas those of us who are traditionalists, we are, if you will, the counterculture.
After Marx, there were a group of Marxists who wisely decided that you could bring this collectivist society to a nation through culture as well. by introducing certain values and concepts that would break down the family, for example. If you could somehow break down the family unit so that it was no longer self-sustaining and no longer valued in a society, then that would leave individual members who formerly could turn to the family for support in times of need. They would now be cut loose. They would be without a place to go in times of need. So now they have to turn to the government.
From the Frankfurt School, which is having a catastrophically destructive effect on our entire civilization. He's behind so many of the problems we see, from social decay, right through to mass immigration. So, in the simplest possible terms, the Frankfurt School was a group of hardcore Marxists who, in the 1920s, 1930s, not surprisingly, were based in Frankfurt. They looked at the question of why the Soviet Revolution, why the Marxist Revolution had happened in Russia and not in Western Europe. Because according to Karl Marx's theories, communism was supposed to be inevitable, the Communist Revolution, the more the capitalist system advanced. So it would therefore happen in the most advanced capitalist countries. So Marx fervently believed it was going to happen in, say, Britain and Germany and France. And of course it didn't. It happened in the most backward country in Europe. So the Frankfurt School set about working out why this was. And they came to the conclusion that it was because that specifically Western civilization, so not just Christianity, well, it was an important part of it, because Russia has that as well, but also the institutions of the more stable West and the national identity of the countries of the West, all these things together, and a legal system that worked, and churches that were respected, and a military that was respected, and so on. All these things were a block to the Communist Revolution. So therefore, rather than wasting their time trying to persuade the workers to rise up and revolt, their idea was that they'd attack the foundations of Western civilization, because once they'd gone, once there was no longer, say, respect of young people for their elders, as just one example, it would make it easier to have a communist revolution. So that's where they started. And so they decided to do it primarily in two ways. The first was what they called the culture of critique, which was just a system of thought whereby they would simply critique, attack, verbally and intellectually attack aspects of Western civilization, the church, the family, democracy and so on, proper democracy. They simply attack and attack and attack, and like water dripping on a stone, would gradually wear it away. And the point isn't to something which began before then, but then was stepped up in the 60s. Of course, their other way of dealing with Western society was to replace the Western people with mass immigration. And the most extraordinary example of that coming out was Frank Field, the Liverpudlian Labour MP, a couple of years ago actually said that in the 1960s there was a conspiracy to do away with what he described as the white race in Britain. Again, they came up with already two key extra ways of working. The first was the idea of building a rainbow alliance of grievances. And so they'd find different groups, they'd persuade them that Western society and the patriarchal society, capitalist society, the nation and so on, in some way discriminates against them, and then use that discrimination against them to bring them into a larger alliance of disparate groups, very often in fact mutually hostile and antagonistic, or certainly with different interests. A classic example now would be the way in which the left tries on the one side to mobilise and use the homosexual lobby, and on the other side works with radical Islam, which wants to stone homosexuals to death. There's no principles here, it's just a matter of them dragging everyone they can into this big broad...